Hello, and today I'm going to analyze an already famous game played in the ninth round of the Altibox Norway Chess Championships, and it's the Carlsen versus Firouzja match. So after 8 rounds, Carlsen was leading the tournament with 16.5 points and followed by ALIREJA with 15.5 points. So now let's take a closer look into the game and see how the game unfolded. So playing with the white pieces, Firouzja plays knight to f3. It's a ready opening, and knight to f6 by Carlsen, and g3 and c5. So bishop to g2 and knight to c6. Now Firouzja castles on the king side. Now e5 by Carlsen, e4. Now d6 and c3. Now g6 and d4. Now c takes d4 and c takes d4. Bishop to g4 and c takes d takes c5 and d takes c5. Now knight to c3. Now bishop to g7, preparing for castling on the king side. Now h3, attacking the bishop on g4 and bishop into f3. So here Firouzja decided to trade the queens, queen into d8 and rook into d8. Now and bishop into f3. Now Carlsen castles on the king side. Now king to g2 by Firouzja. Now and knight to d4, attacking the bishop on f3. Now bishop to g5 with the idea of bringing the rook into the game, and h6, attacking the bishop. So here Firouzja decided to trade the bishop for a knight by playing bishop into f6 and bishop into f6. Now knight to d5, attacking the bishop on f6. So rook to d6 comes in support of the bishop on f6. So if knight into f6, then rook into f6, that will put more pressure on the f3 bishop. Firouzja plays rook a to c1. Here Firouzja gets an open rook file. So his idea is to play rook to c7 and attack the b7 pawn. So Carlsen stops that idea with playing bishop to d8, controlling the c7 square. So now rook a to d1, rook f to d1. So Carlsen foresees this idea and he plays king to g7, and now knight to e3 by Firouzja and rook to a6, attacking the a2 pawn. Carlsen goes after the a2 pawn. So a3 and h5, stopping white from playing knight to g4 and attack the e5 pawn. So here Firouzja finds another idea to attack the e5 pawn by playing knight to c4. So after knight to c4, bishop to f6 comes in rescue of the e5 pawn, and h4 by Firouzja. So now rook to c8. Here Carlsen gets a semi-open rook file. Now knight to e3 plays Firouzja, and Carlsen decides to double the rooks by playing rook a to c6. So Firouzja takes the rook, trading of rooks, rook into c6. Now rook to d3 with the idea of playing rook to c3 and trade the rooks. Firouzja here wants to trade the rooks. So bishop to d8 by Carlsen and bishop to d1, and now rook to c1 by Carlsen, bishop to b3 by Firouzja. If Carlsen takes the bishop on b3, then rook into d8 is what Firouzja is planning. Firouzja will take the rook on d8. So b5 by Carlsen, and now rook to d1. Firouzja wants to eliminate the rook on c1. He finds that rook on c1 as a threat. So Carlsen retreats back to c8, rook to c8. Now bishop to a2, further protecting the bishop. So a5 by Carlsen, further promoting the pawns. Now rook to d3 with the idea of playing rook c3 and trade the rooks. Here Firouzja is again trying to trade the rooks, so a4 plays Carlsen, and now king to f1, bringing the king into the game. Firouzja bringing the king into the game. So bishop to b6 and rook to c3. Here Carlsen accepts the offer by taking the rook on c3, b into c3, attacking the knight. So knight comes to b3. Here if Firouzja takes the knight on b3, then a into b3, Carlsen will play a into b3, so there is no stopping the b3 pawn. White's knight on e3 cannot prevent the pawn promotion, the b3 pawn. Firouzja didn't play bishop into b3, but with this move the bishop on a2 is almost dead. The mobility, the bishop on a2 is immobile. So king to e1 plays Firouzja, and bishop to c5, attacking the pawn on a3. So now knight to c2 plays Firouzja, comes in support of the a3 pawn. So now knight to c1, attacking the bishop on a2. So bishop goes to d5 and knight to d3 with a check and attack on f2 pawn. Here Carlsen is about to win the pawn and he takes the pawn on f2. Now bishop to c6, attacking the b5 pawn. Here Firouzja also counter attacks, and he's also trying to win as many pawns as possible. Here Carlsen is not bothered about the b5 pawn, so he plays here Carlsen plays f6 and knight to e3. Now knight to h1 by Carlsen, going after the g3 pawn. So knight to f1 plays Firouzja, comes in support of the g3 pawn. Now bishop takes the a3 pawn. Here Carlsen wins a pawn, and bishop into b5. Firouzja also wins a pawn, and the pawn on e4 is hanging. So Carlsen plays bishop to b2, going after the c3 pawn and also trying to promote the a3 pawn. So here the only move, so Firouzja takes the pawn on a4, otherwise Carlsen can promote the pawn. So bishop into c3, Carlsen also wins a pawn, and now king to f3 with the idea of playing king to g2 and attack the knight on h1. So bishop to d4 was played to support the knight on h1, because knight can play knight to f2. King plays g2, then knight can play f2 and find an escape route. So after king to f3, after d4, g4 by Firouzja. Now h into g4 and king into g4, knight to f2 check, and king to f3, king to h6. Carlsen also bringing his king into the game. So now knight to g3 and knight to d3 by Carlsen. So bishop to e8 with the idea of playing h5. So here Carlsen plays knight to f4, stopping the h5 idea of Firouzja. Now knight to e2. Firouzja wants to trade the knight, which Carlsen declines and plays knight to e6. So now bishop to f7, attacking the bishop on e6. So knight to c5 and knight to g3, bishop to c3, and now h5 by Firouzja. So bishop to e1. Now bishop into g6. Carlsen sacrifices a pawn. He wants to trade his bishop for white's knight. So bishop into g3 and king into g3. Now king to g5, king to f3 by Firouzja. So now knight to b3, with the idea of playing knight to d2 and give a check on. So now bishop to f7 attacking the knight on b3. So here knight to d4 check. So king to g3 and knight to e2 check, king to f3, knight to f4 and king to g3. Here Carlsen is about to win another pawn on h5. So he takes the pawn on h5, knight into h5 and bishop into h5, king into h5. The game is almost going the drawish way. So now king to h3 and king to h6. Now king to h4 by Firouzja. Now king goes to g7. Carlsen plays g7 and king to g3, king to f8, king to f2 and king to e7, king e2, king e8, king e3. Both the players are trying for a draw. King to d7 by Carlsen, king to d3 and now king to d6 and king to c3. And this king to c3 was a mistake by, it was a blunder by Firouzja, which allows Carlsen to play king to c5. It was in this position on move 69 that Firouzja resigned the game, because Carlsen can go on to win the pawn on e4, and Carlsen is having connected pawn chain also. And with this win, Carlsen wins the Altibox Norway Chess Championship 2020 with a round to spare and wins the 7 lakh Norwegian kroner in prize money event. But in the 10th round, Carlsen lost the game against Levon Aronian, which didn't make an impact on the points tally. And Firouzja came second with his final round win against Duda. So Altibox Norway Chess was a very well organized tournament with all the precautions taken, and it was indeed a feast for the chess world. So hope you all enjoyed the game. Stay tuned for more action from the world of chess. Let's hope that we get to see more of the over the board tournaments soon. So keep supporting my channel. Do share, like and comment on my videos, and take care and thank you.